Welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of Smith Weekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion today, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at Smith Weekly, including Jack T, Luke A, Ryan S, Andy J, and Mike P. We have a new guest on the program today, and one that I'm very excited to speak with. Miss Judith Curry has joined the show. Judith is the president of Climate Forecast Applications Network, founded in 2006, professor emerita at Georgia Institute of Technology, and author of the book Climate Uncertainty and Risk. You can learn more about Judith and her work by visiting her website, judithcurry.com. Ms. Curry, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Welcome.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Very much looking forward to talking with you and getting your take on many different subjects, and also just you being able to share your wisdom with us, Judy. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. Typically, to kick things off here, what we like to do is we like to talk about the background and experience of our guests. And of course, in your case, to establish that you are a professional of your field. And just for the audience, let me hit some of the highlights as you come highly recommended. Then I'd like to hear from you. But just on universities, institutions, and agencies, University of Chicago, PhD, Northern Illinois University, Bachelor's of Science, Georgia Institute of Technology, University of Colorado, Purdue, Penn State, University of Wisconsin. Fields of experience: geophysical sciences, atmospheric sciences, meteorology, aerospace engineering sciences, atmospheric and oceanic sciences. Lots of stuff there. And then also just a number of honors and memberships, of which I won't get into, and of course awards, because there's a lot of them, but I want to mention just a couple. But just to highlight, the National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award, and also an award from NASA. Judy, why don't you just backfill us here a little bit? Talk about some of the highlights of your career and some of the things that you'd like to mention that I've probably missed here, because it's a long resume and it's quite qualified.
Well, I got my PhD in 1982, and I spent most of my career in academia. And I moved around a fair amount as, opportunities arose. My latest academic appointment was at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology, where I served as chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences for 13 years. I've been involved in the World Climate Research Program, the U.S. National Research Council. I've held appointments on committees and boards for NASA, the Department of Energy, NOAA, the National Science Foundation. So I've been fairly active in the science policy interface, as well as my own personal research, which has ranged on a variety of topics in atmospheric and oceanic sciences, broadly related to climate variability and change. Um, More recently, say since about 2010, I've been working on a range of topics that you might call more philosophy of science, largely related to uncertainty and epistemology of climate modeling. I've also, through work with my company, Climate Forecast Applications Network, we help companies and government agencies help understand and manage their weather and climate related risks. So I've taken a deep dive into risk sciences and decision making under deep uncertainty. And you see all of that reflected in my latest book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. I've also authored several textbooks during my time: Thermodynamics of Atmospheres and Oceans, and Kinetics, Microphysics, Thermodynamics of Clouds. So I retired from my university position in 2017, and I went full time in the private sector since then.
I think there's a lot of stuff there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you're older and much more experienced. You have way more wisdom than I do, but certainly these experience and this diversification of a career, and of course taking opportunities like everybody should, especially when you move around, you take different opportunities in your field, is that you also establish a very understood, experienced mindset in terms of your experience throughout life and throughout your career. And of course, you form various positions on things much more informed than you would have had you been in your teenage years or even in your 20s, and in some cases, maybe even 30s for some people, depending on how you're brought up and where you're brought up and all the other parameters surrounding that. But it's interesting in the sense that, as we get older, we also become a little bit more set in our ways as well. And to have some of the experience that you have. And again, I'll just say for myself, I mean, I haven't been around as long as you have, and I certainly can say that I'm nowhere
Mhm.
close to your level of expertise and experience being on basically a low level dropout from a master's program down to a bachelor's of science and an associate's in business, political science, and history at Oregon State. Just hope that one day I can learn a portion of what maybe you've forgotten over your career. But one of the things I wanted to ask you here, just to tie this in, was throughout all of my life, I've consistently heard of things like global warming, greenhouse gases. If I remember, I think it was called CFCs, killing our atmosphere, ice caps melting away. Basically, melt all that into the current term, I suppose, which is what people often refer to as climate change. A lot of people who say that word probably don't understand half of it, but that's the current term that's being used. And for me, I suspect that climate has evolved and changed going back thousands of years and beyond that. My question is to you is, as humans, maybe living 80 years if we're lucky, and gaining experience and hopefully wisdom and knowledge during that time, how do we as humans measure and even comprehend climate change if we only have the immediate past to draw upon?
Well, we do have a fairly good understanding of the climate broadly defined over the Earth's history going back, millions to billions of years even. We have a general sense of how it's varied and some reasons as to why it's varied in those ways. Recent climate change, say for the last 200 years, I mean, 200 years ago, we were in the midst of a big, a little ice age, not a big, a little ice age. It was the coldest period of the last 1,000 years. There were three explosive volcanic eruptions in the early 1800s that cooled the climate considerably. So it was a fairly, hostile time with famines and, generally bad weather. So, so when people hold up the pre-industrial climate as some sort of a, Goldilocks climate, well, that's rather a joke because it was in the middle of the little ice age. So, we've been warming. The modern warming started in about 1860. And overall, so far, I would have to say that the warming has been beneficial. And, people have adapted to the slow creep of global warming. But there's always been environmental concerns. Back when I was younger, I mean, of course, global cooling was an issue. Acid rain was a big issue. Um, yeah, the CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and the ozone hole, and on and go. So there's always been concerns about how humans might be impacting their environment. But let's face it, there's now 8 billion of us and counting. Of course, we're going to have an impact on the environment. The challenge for us is to understand our impact and minimize it, where we can, in a no regret sense. We just have to get over the fact that humans impact the planet. So that's just, some context for how I view all this. So the answer, yes, we are warming, and yes, humans are contributing to it. But the weakest part of their argument is whether this warming is dangerous. And I would have to say that so far it hasn't been.
I appreciate you covering that off because there's a lot to talk about and probably way more to talk about than we can cover in maybe an hour podcast or whatever this turns out to be. But part of what you said there is the other piece of this, of course, that comes in is the discussion of CO2, what I'll just call the war on CO2, because of course, yes, we have impacts. Of course, animals have impacts. Natural disasters have impacts. Lots of things have impacts on this world in which we live. Obviously, we need to try to be as responsible as possible. I think everybody can agree on that. At the same time, we also have to live as normal human beings and hopefully have a traditional life that we would expect, and also the pursuit of happiness and profit and all the other things that go with that, right, Judy? And the next part I was going to ask you about was I want to come back to atmosphere in a minute, but just your overall thoughts on CO2. Is it CO2, the increases in levels of CO2? And of course, my understanding is, again, I haven't spent near as much time as you have on it, but CO2 levels historically, today, and maybe going forward, maybe there's a trend that's being established here, but CO2 levels increasing, how risky is that? What's the impacts of CO2 levels increasing? But then at the same time, talk us about the downside. What happens if CO2 levels decrease too much? And obviously, we breathe it, we exhale it, plants need it. What do you think about this war on CO2, and is it justified?
Well, by burning fossil fuels and our agricultural practices and our industrial practices, we are emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's not disputed. These gases do have infrared emission spectra, so they act in the direction of warming the planet. So these things aren't controversial, except how much warming from additional CO2 is actually quite uncertain. Factor of 3 uncertainty in the sensitivity of the climate to increasing CO2. I mean, and this is in the UN climate assessment reports. I mean, this isn't too controversial that there's uncertainty into how much this increase of CO2 is warming the planet. So we don't know. There's a complex global carbon cycle. Oceans release CO2 into the atmosphere, and they also serve as a carbon dioxide sink. Land processes, vegetation uses CO2 to grow. Plants are fairly happy with the rising CO2. And in fact, the planet is observed to be greening. Satellite observations over the past several decades have shown most of the world's regions greening, including having greater leaf area and being frankly more green as viewed from satellite. So it is what it is. You know, this thinking that pre-industrial temperatures were the Goldilocks zone and that increasing CO2 is bad because it increases temperatures and various follow-on effects from increasing temperatures. Well, yeah, there's some impact, but we've adapted to the slow creep of warming over the 20th century, and we've done just fine. Population has increased substantially, and fewer people are living in poverty. Life expectancy has increased. Fewer people, far fewer people, lose their lives owing to weather disasters like hurricanes or whatever. So, agricultural productivity has increased substantially with little increase in overall land usage for agriculture. So, we're actually doing pretty well right now. So, these concerns are about what might happen in the future. And, you know, they've spun a narrative and they've presupposed that warming is dangerous, which I don't think it is. And the slow creep of warming, it's something we can easily adapt to. I mean, the way that they've amped up the danger is to attribute every extreme weather event, hurricane, wildfire, flood, heat wave, cold outbreak, everything, they attribute everything to global warming. If the wine making is bad in a certain region, we'll blame global warming. You know, every migration is blamed on global warming. Just everything is blamed on global warming, when global warming essentially has nothing to do with it. But it's used to amp up the alarm, and it's become a convenient scapegoat. You know, when something bad happens, like the collapse of the Libyan dam, that's the most recent really bad catastrophe. Well, that dam was crumbling and falling apart for decades, and they were well aware of it. And then they get some heavy rains and kaboom, you know, the dam breaks. So is that global warming, or is that poor governance? Is it lack of investment in the infrastructure? In Canada, the wildfires have just been insane this year. But part of the reason that they've gotten so bad, yeah, and this was the case in Maui, we had really bad wildfires in Maui. And the issues is that more attention is being, for the electric. A lot of this is caused by, at least especially in Maui, sparking from electric utility lines, in high winds. The electric utilities in Maui are paying far more attention to installing new wind and solar power while neglecting cutting back the non-native vegetation, which is very flammable. So it was just very, very easy for that fire to spread because of the non-native vegetation that hadn't been cut back from the region where the main power lines are. But no, let's blame it on CO2 driven warming. And that way we don't need to own up to our responsibilities and the mistakes that we've made. So you see this everywhere. Global warming is just a cop out for not taking care of our environment, not paying attention to our infrastructure, not having good warning practices, not having good governance. It's just used as an excuse for everything that goes wrong. And it's a very convenient scapegoat.
Want to come back and maybe you can just, as we talk here, maybe highlight some of the folks that you refer to as they a little bit, just in some of the agendas that are out there, and also a little bit about the control narrative that also factors into this. And everybody individually should have the right to make their own decisions and do their own research, do the work, and don't rely upon some person that you don't even know to make your decisions for you. It also comes back to technical careers, technical professionals in the world is very important to the way of life and also just advancement as a species. I think that's also an interesting piece of just lack of technical expertise in so many industries now. But let's leave all that for a moment. A number of things you said. The wealth generated by fossil fuels and the era of fossil fuel energy, which I do believe is being phased out. But while you might not use fossil fuels for energy in 100 years or what have you, I don't know, fossil fuels will be utilized in other things. I can think of lots of products that we use daily that have fossil fuels as a component. And I'll be honest with you, you take that away, I'm not seeing how some of these components make it, but can we improve energy, which we'll come back to? Absolutely. Do we need fossil fuels for energy? Probably not. Why that hasn't transitioned faster, of course, is because of, well, follow the money. You mentioned also just that we're living longer. Coca-Cola sales, CO2, great sales coming reporting out of Coca-Cola. Great job, CO2. They're contributing. Beachfront real estate. Last I checked, there's not a bear market in beachfront real estate, Judy. It's actually quite robust. And even in light of Maui and what happened there, and maybe some of the motivations behind that, in the history books, definitely there's always the arson that occurs throughout human history, which is always interesting to research and look into as well. But besides that, to put power transmission underground, really good example like this is, island nations that constantly get whacked by hurricanes. Underground infrastructure for energy would be quite useful. Of course, it's more expensive. One of the things, just on what you said there with the fires, that you're right. Just because of a bird nest in a tree near a transmission line, let's come back to the United States for a moment, the maintenance can be neglected because of a certain species, whether it's a worm or a bird or what have you, or a certain time of the year in which there's migratory birds. They transit over transmission lines that you can't maintain that line properly because of all the regulations from the agencies. And so you've had no maintenance, like you said. Just back to the comment you made there about just, humans' impact on this earth. Of course, there's impacts. We do lots of activities on this earth, but do you think we're an invasive species? Or do you think it was by design that humans are supported on earth and maybe it was factored in?
I don't think either. Humans exist, and we're the dominant species on the planet, so we're sort of in charge of various things, and humans want to thrive and flourish. That's a natural thing to want. However, there's this big movement, a degrowth movement, anti not just anti-fossil fuels, but anti-capitalist, anti-democracy, anti, everything. And the UN is very big on all this. They like the idea of non-governmental control by a global body such as United Nations. So, we put impediments in our way. The fact that the planet is currently supporting 8 billion people with a relatively small fraction of them in poverty is really quite remarkable. We owe that to technology and in a large way to fossil fuels. The challenge moving forward is, like you said, we're almost certainly not going to be burning fossil fuels for electricity and transportation in 2100, but we will, of course, still be using them. So, nuclear power is the obvious, energy source. But there's this, huge anti-nuclear lobby based on all sorts of political and irrational ideas. What really worries me in the near term is this big rush to implement wind and solar power, which is horrendous for the environment. It's not going to give us the energy reliability that we need, and it's turning out to be extremely expensive. A huge amount of transmission lines is required, and that's going to be extremely costly. So I just don't see any way that wind and solar can be a dominant power source. The more we spin our wheels trying to do this, we're destroying economies. I mean, look what's going on in Germany. They've kneecapped their entire economy by thinking that they can go to completely wind and solar. Other countries are starting to realize how insane this is. But, personally, I'm a fan of nuclear and the new geothermal technologies that are coming online. I think this is where the solution lies in terms of inexpensive electricity. And I think we need to have more local generation of electricity because the transmission lines are so vulnerable. And you can't bury the transmission lines everywhere. Like, for example, in Florida, the nature of the underlying ground is very porous limestone. It's just, not right for burying transmission lines. There's no way around that one in some locations, and I assume that's the case with some of these islands, Puerto Rico, whatever. The underlying terroir, if you will, it just isn't suitable for, burying the electric power lines. So there's all sorts of complexities here. And, each location, state, country has to figure out what makes sense for them in order to deal with their local natural resources and their local economy and whatever, and see what makes sense for them. But putting these ridiculous targets and deadlines, you urgently need to go to wind and solar that is just doing so much damage in so many ways, to economy, to human development, to the environment. It's just beyond crazy.
Yeah, some very good points, Judy, and certainly some engineering and electrical engineering and just engineering challenges with a lot of different things on some of these solutions. And very interesting, just some of the narratives on how people are pushing in certain directions, I suppose. Why don't we hold on energy for a moment, and I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to go back to an area that you know really well. Give us a basic school education on atmosphere, the various types of atmospheres, some of the gases within, and how the sun impacts us, how the oceans, of course, plant life. You already covered some of that, of course, but just atmospheres in general, and then just give us kind of an understanding of why the focus on just CO2, and maybe that there's something else that we should focus on, and give us a bit of an education, because I think the audience could definitely use that, and so could I.
Okay. The over the several billion years that the planet Earth has been in existence, the climate has varied over, a very, very wide range. For the last 10,000 years or so, since the end of the previous ice age, we've been in a fairly stable climate regime called an interglacial, the mid-Holocene, and fluctuations in the mid-Holocene have come from, changes in the Earth's orbit, the ellipticity, the actual axial tilt, things like that. The solar has gone through various cycles of internal activity in terms of how much energy it emits. We've had volcanic eruptions, which substantially influence our climate. But the thing that really influences more on multi-decadal time scales, the time scale of a human life, is really the large scale ocean circulation patterns and the oscillations. And these ocean circulation patterns, the variation that you're most familiar with would be the El Nino and La Nina events. I mean, those are basically ocean circulation events. but they have, there's variations on decadal time scales, century time scales, and even millennial time scales. And these large-scale ocean circulation patterns influence the atmosphere, influences the clouds, which determine how much radiation from the sun actually is absorbed in the atmosphere and near the surface, and a whole host of things. So there's all these processes going on. And on top of this, humans are to some extent changing the composition of the atmosphere. Yes, you hear about carbon dioxide, but there's some other trace gases that are relevant to methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, for example. But humans also emit, particulates, like the air pollution. When you look outside and the sky is hazy, the air quality is bad, or the smoke from a forest fire, whatever. So humans, burning fossil fuels emits small particles into the atmosphere, which act to reflect the sun, have a cooling effect, and also influence the properties of the clouds, making them more or less reflective. So these are just some of the processes that are going on, and it's the accumulation of all these processes that, determine, what our climate looks like on time scale of a few years to a few decades. So that's sort of the factors that in play. The issue with the UN climate assessments is that they focus on carbon dioxide and these trace gases. I mean, they downplay variations in the sun. They regard these ocean oscillations as noise. They relatively ignore volcanoes, since after all, the last 150 years there haven't been very many big volcanoes, so let's just ignore them for now. So they've just oversimplified the climate into, the so-called carbon dioxide control knob, where we can, change the climate by dialing up the CO2 concentration or dialing it down, which is a complete joke, because we have a very complex nonlinear climate system. Sure, we do influence it, but there's no way we can control it. We need to abandon the idea that we can control the climate, with CO2 emissions. Sure, we influence it, but even if we were to immediately shut off CO2 emissions, the climate would still, even after 50 years, the climate might still be warming. It takes a long time for the oceans and the carbon cycle and the ice sheets to come into some sort of an equilibrium. And, there's very long timescales involved here. We've just oversimplified this whole issue of climate change by ignoring natural climate variability.
Interesting. I suppose, Judy, maybe I'm completely wrong with this, but if you've come from a part of the world that's been able to live in abundance for the last generation or two, or what have you, tend to get lazy and you want to simplify things when things are very complex. And I think that's in terms of just people wanting to oversimplify things. Let's not focus on the details, which of course that's not good. But basically, just that abundance has resulted in people wanting to try these things, wanting to try new systems of government, which we already know how that works, because human beings are human beings, right? Whether you're a government official or you're a person in the private sector, it doesn't matter. You're still a human being. You still do the same activities. You're no different. Just because you drive an electric car doesn't mean you're any better than someone who drives a gasoline internal combustion engine. Let's go take a look at where you plug in at night, see where that energy goes to. Is it a coal plant in Colorado? What is it? So people want to generally avoid the technical hard work and just kind of make generalizations. And I guess that leads me to just another question. You're a person that's a technical person. There's a lot of details in the work that you do. You're credentialed, you're qualified, you've had firsthand experience to back up what determinations you've made throughout your career about these issues that we've discussed in part today so far. What do you think the motive is behind the scenes based on what you've seen? And how do we mitigate that? Is this a money grab? Is it a control grab? What do you think?
All of the above. I mean, the political roots of all this go back to the 1980s. The UN Environmental Program, it's an anti-capitalist, anti-fossil fuel organization. It has all the world radicals in the UN Environmental Program. And they were looking for a cause that would, promote their desire for globalization. They hated fossil fuels. When the climate issue came along, they said, okay, this is our ticket. And by 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change had a treaty that 196 countries signed, including the US, to eliminate fossil fuel emissions to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. This was in 1992, before we had any evidence, that there was any kind of unusual warming. So the policy cart has been way out in front of the scientific horse from the very beginning on this. So it's politics, and then people figured out how to make money off of it. You got a lot of, young activists who were interested in this problem. They went and got their PhD. They now dominate the universities. So you've got this whole, idea. There was a recent survey of university faculty members working broadly in the climate area, and 70% of them were in favor of degrowth. Not just green growth, but actual degrowth. They want fewer people. They want no fossil fuels. They want people to go back and live in huts. I don't know. But that's the mindset, that is dominating this. It's a political mindset. It, over the decades, has become entrenched politically in the UN. It's become entrenched politically in the universities and the main information that we have. And of course, the media amplifies it even more into an alarm. There's all sorts of, social factors that are in play that are reinforcing this whole thing. But, and how are people supposed to sort this out? Even scientists who would have essentially the same credentials that I do, can put, 50 of us in a room and we're going to disagree. And that's because this is a deeply highly complex, uncertain problem, and there's a lot that we don't know. So if you can't get, scientists, say, with my credentials in a room to agree, then how is the general public supposed to sort this out? But the root of the problem, so you just say, well, it's okay. We don't need to have agreement. I mean, disagreement is what drives scientific progress forward. What's driving the need for consensus and agreement is the desire to control. I mean, not just to control the social, economics, politics of the whole thing, but also to control the climate. And this is a completely naive and stupid idea that politicians have been stuck on, since about 1990. They're just thinking they can control the climate. Well, get over it. You can't. So, I mean, that's what's in play. And it's very complex. And you can find people who will disagree with me, and you'll find people who agree with me. But as an example, how hard it is for the average person to figure this out. When the COVID pandemic struck, I was just fascinated, apart from, concerns about my personal health and the health of my family and employees. I was just fascinated by this. And I really spent a lot of time, looking into it, reading all the primary literature, trying to separate the signal from the noise, and on and on. It was exceedingly difficult to do. I mean, the World Health Organization, the US CDC were just making stupid proclamations. And then you get the politicians involved. And it was, I thought about by analogy how hopeless it was for people to try to sort out the whole climate thing. I mean, given all the noise, based on my ethics or my personal experience in terms of trying to sort out all the COVID information and misinformation and whatever. So it's very hard. So what we need to do, and this is a central theme of my book, is we have to don't pretend that you're going to understand everything, and abandon the notion that you can control these complex global wicked problems, and do your best to understand them and figure out how to manage the risks. People are able to come to agreement on solutions a lot easier than they are to come to agreement on the causes. Like, people will disagree about carbon dioxide and climate and all of that stuff until they're blue in the face, but everybody can agree that we need more R&D on energy technologies, and we need to reduce our vulnerability to extreme weather events. Everybody can agree on that. And if you abandon, if you abandon control, the idea that you can control all this, you abandon all those crazy targets and timelines. Sure, we should try to lower our impact on the environment as much as reasonably practical, but we just have to accept that we are going to have a footprint on this planet, and we just need to figure out how to adapt.
Very good points. Lots of stuff to unpack. It's just a very interesting conundrum we found ourselves in. And also, Judy, that you mentioned that who are certain countries or certain unelected organizations to levy and mandate a developing country don't have an air conditioning in their home, or you cannot have the access to maybe the wealth creation that my country has had, or what have you. And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult object and hurdle to overcome if you're going to start to tell other countries and people you've never even personally met what you will do.
Well,
I
well,
don't
that's
see how that works out so well.
Well, that's the most immoral aspect of this whole thing. I've been a strong advocate for electrifying Africa, and I work with developing countries in South Asia and also Africa. My company does. The issue is all of the money that used to go into development, like from the World Bank, the UN, all these aid organizations that used to go into development, reducing poverty, and trying to provide them with energy. Now, all of that has been redirected into so-called mitigation. Wind and solar, and these countries have to sign agreements not to develop fossil fuel resources in order to get loans, and on it goes. And in Africa, they have a lot of fossil fuel resources, a lot of coal, a lot of natural gas, a lot of oil, and they don't have the money or the infrastructure for the most part to actually use it to, power their country. So they end up, selling off all their fossil fuel resources to Europe and Asia to support their, high emission, high energy lifestyle. And, this is all completely immoral. They call it green colonialism.
Mm.
I can't remember some of the other names, but they're very apt. And it's the most unethical and immoral thing that I can think of is trying to hold back these populations in Africa and other developing countries. I mean, all for hypothetical harms that probably won't really be noticeable until the 22nd century, if at all. So
Yeah.
it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, stay in your lane and stay out of other people's business. That's, I think, the basics of this. And unfortunately, those things are being eroded, and they're being eroded on multiple fronts, whether it's economic leverage, whether it's social leverage, what have you. My choice to put beans and rice on the table is my choice. And irrespective of what the impacts are, I need that fuel to live and provide for my family. It really is hypocritical. It's just an absolute shame to see some of these things happen. And some of the policymakers that, again, unelected, some of these organizations, I mean, you brought up the UN first here, and I guess we'll pick on them just a little bit. The mandate has changed a lot since World War II. I can't remember the last time, Judy, that I've heard of a government organization, an agency, or an unelected organization that's backed by government ever be dissolved. I've never seen any lawmakers who are their purpose is to wake up every day and make laws and regulations and administrative rules and code of rules and everything else that you have. I don't see any rollbacks. All I see is continued squeeze. And obviously, when your whole job is to make rules, and you do it at the municipal level, you do it at the county level, you do it at the state level, you do it at the federal level, you do it at the to be global control level, it's pretty clear that this all can't end well. Finances, economics, social, all of these angles happening right now, and you're in the midst of it too, of course, in the states. This is a place that's festering with a lot of this right now. You brought this the COVID piece up. Government giving medical advice. What about my doctor? Government giving financial and scientific advice. What about my financial advisor and my personal scientist? What about me just going and doing my own work? Why can't I go and do my own work without being pushed in a certain direction? And I guess with that, I'll just say recently, I'm completely surprised by this and appalled that one of our recent episodes of our podcast, happy to say humbly, a very small mining and energy focused podcast that almost nobody listens to, gets flagged with a UN notice. To me, it's a big red flag to have something so small and so almost meaningless in terms of coverage and impact. You mentioned social media influencers. It's a huge red flag to me. I've never seen this before. I think it's absolutely nuts. And so, with any comments you have, but then ask you this question: talk about the funding for science, and is it mostly biased?
Okay, well, the funding for climate science or any science, is tied to political priorities. There's very little funding, for truly basic research, specifically with regards to, say, climate science. I mean, this is what I would call use-inspired research and policy-relevant research. The government's agencies in the US and Europe, those are the ones I'm most familiar with. And I assume it's the same in Australia, but I don't know what goes on in China or anything like that. But they're looking to support the national political agenda, which is tied to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and to support the UN climate assessment reports, which are tied to looking for dangerous human caused climate change. So the announcements for opportunities that go out, relate in some way to or implicitly assume dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So, if you want research funding in the climate area, I mean, you would be wanting to hew to the party line, so to speak. So, I mean, if there's just anything that would be looking to rethink, how we view the whole climate system would be regarded as non-responsive to most announcements of opportunity for funding. So there's just, no government funding for what I would say broader perspectives on all these things. And so there's a lot of foundation support. I mean, Bill Gates is funding a ton of stuff. The Gates Foundation and other organizations fund a lot of research and a lot of applied research. But the big money, is all going in, how shall I say, the supporting the alarming narrative. And anytime a petroleum company or an oil company, and we're talking billions of dollars from, Tom Steyer and Bill Gates and, all these people, are talking billions. And anytime an oil company or petroleum company spends 100K supporting somebody, then they're up in arms, and the person who received that money is in the pay of big oil, and they're regarded as disgraced, and on it goes. So it's just, so the people who are, doing a lot of the meaningful research are people who are retired, people from other fields who are independently wealthy, who become interested in the topic, and people in the private sector. I mean, these are the people who are providing different perspectives. You don't get any of it from the government labs or the government funded university researchers. So and so, I get criticized for having some oil companies as clients of my company, my weather and climate services company, but and it's so ridiculous. Like all of a sudden I've been bribed by oil companies. Well, if I cared about money, I would have kept my big salary at Georgia Tech. In the private sector, I'm making a lot less money than I did in the university. So it's just a whole senseless situation. And there's not, there's plenty of alternative perspectives out there, but they're generally ignored by the media. They don't get government funding. They don't get invited to participate in the UN assessment reports, and on it goes. So what we have is policy-driven science.
That's not science.
No, no.
Terrible about this. The structure is degraded and eroded. And you could also make an argument now, even in the medical field, that that also is happening, and it's because of special interests and these desires for control. Lunacy. I don't know how else to put it. A lot of the stuff there that you mentioned is just very difficult to chew through and to be able to sort out. But I think a basic work and review of this would definitely lead to a lot of questions, and people have to ask questions. That's what has to happen. And that's where education comes in and life experience. You and I both went to university. Obviously, you have way more credentials than I do. But one thing at university I certainly learned is everybody has opinions, including the professors and the instructors. And then there's also fact. do what you want. Certainly, I learned some good discipline in college. I didn't learn everything. Of course, I was a young person that enjoyed friends and the parties in college town. How effective and how good can you be at that age, I guess, is maybe the question resulting from that. Paid a lot of money for that. But like you said before, the different opinions. You put 10 accountants, lawyers, doctors, nutritionists, scientists, and investment advisors in the same room, and you'll get 7 to 9 different opinions within each area of expertise. I think that that's constructive in the sense that people have to debate, present evidence, debate again, come up with theories, disprove and approve some of those theories, and actually come to it. I mean, I don't know, is the earth round or square? I don't know. Maybe people are going to try to talk about that, but just because someone else tells you that the sky is red and it's not blue, do some work. You mentioned earlier about the people suggesting that maybe we should go back to live in huts or caves or what have you, which maybe for some it would be useful. The same people who talk about and promote this seem to be very well off. They have nice cars, they use smartphones, they use all the products that they basically are telling us not to use because of the carbon input or the impact on fossil fuels or what have you. Most of our plastics and a lot of other things come from fossil fuels, and mining is obviously a huge beneficiary of all this. Because all the materials we need comes from the ground, and even things like fertilizer, which goes on our plants, well, that's mined too. And so maybe Smith Weekly Research should retain you and get your expertise on science. What's wrong with that? I mean, people have psychiatrists. Why can't we have scientists in the room?
I mean, the whole issue is, yeah, well, yeah, which scientist? Do you want one of the activist scientists, or do you want a scientist who really has some context in terms of the philosophy of science? So there's a huge spectrum.
Yes.
So saying that scientists, are some sort of, gods that we need to listen to scientists, well, there's a heck of a lot of activist scientists out there that you don't want to listen to. So I don't think that's any panacea. I think we just need to abandon this idea that we can control all these complex things, move towards a risk management approach. People are stupid believing really stupid things. I mean, that's a sign of, a lack of education. And, that's always a challenge. But even for, people who do go to university, there's not a sufficient emphasis on actual critical thinking. They just learn a bunch of facts, and they pass tests and they get grades, and they, forget most of what they learn. They have a credential and get a job, and, all of it gets lost. But how to think, critical thinking, being wide read and being exposed to diverse perspectives, including political perspectives. I mean, that's what we should be exposing young adults to in the universities, and that's not what our universities look like these days.
True. And I think for me, again, I'm not as old as you are, but in my experience, I've learned that listening to older people that have been there and done that is some of the most useful wisdom transfer that I've encountered. Even when I went to university, Judy, you already had that transition of basically a standardized format that's desensitized. And essentially now you have a system that is basically creates a desensitized view of the human being in terms of almost commercial cattle farm, if you will. Everybody on this earth is human being, but some people think that somehow they're above that and they can levy without regard on millions of people, and that people should be able to make their own decisions and do their own work.
With age, hopefully, comes a certain amount of wisdom. But what I've found is, the people, once you leave the university environment and having to play that game, you're able to be more objective. But if your job depends on, you're saying, and you have a mortgage to pay and kids to put through college and whatever, you're not going to rock the boat or jeopardize your job. So, um,
Yes.
so being old enough to be financially independent in some way also helps, in addition to just like accumulated experiences and wisdom.
Very much. And I guess with that, just we'll stay on that. Just overall wisdom transfer, Judy. Of course, you have to look at restructuring some of these systems that are in place. Talking about the overall wisdom transfer on technical skills, because I think you and I can both agree without engineers, without sanitation, clean water, which requires chemistry and a bunch of other things, if you have a shortage of technical jobs, electrical engineering, infrastructure technology, all these things, that are technical, focused, and oriented, which a lot of people will tend to shy away from that. And if you can get a job as a social media influencer and get paid by clicks, that's more convenient potentially than actually having to learn a technical skill that actually has impact on backbone of infrastructure and society. But to me, things get pretty rough if you don't have clean water, you don't have your garbage picked up, you don't have all those processing, sanitation, energy that's stable, internet that's stable, all of that background technical skill work. I think that there's a shortage of that happening in many industries, if not completely. What are your thoughts on that?
When we had the COVID lockdowns, certain people were classified as critical workers. Okay, these were people, who just, kept the shelves on the grocery store full and, gasoline at the stations and, basic things, and repair people and hospital workers, and these are really the critical workers that, help our society, function. And they get paid nothing for the most part. These are the workers that get paid nothing, as opposed to, university professors with their 250K salaries or whatever university salaries are these days. I mean, it just sort of made me think about, who's really critical here. And it certainly isn't the egghead activist professors. It's really people who help, function in our day-to-day life. And then, of course, the entrepreneurs who, bring new ideas to market and actually have them help improve things. So our ideas and who gets rewarded financially is somewhat backwards in many ways. And life is too easy. This is, for many people in the US. And I see a lot of second generation Americans, the parents emigrated and then the children sort of grew up. And these are the kids who are just really working so hard and doing so well and being so ambitious, as opposed to, kids growing up in wealthy families and, they're aspire to a Kardashian kind of lifestyle. So, there's some sort of screwed up values, in really prosperous countries, when you're so far away from having to worry about basic needs, that we see these kids, the Extinction Rebellion, oh, our world is going to end and all this kind of stuff. And they don't realize that they live in the best time ever to be a human on this planet. And so we just have this really warped perspective in affluent countries in many ways that, is at the
Right.
root of some of this insanity, I think.
Unfortunately, I think that history is pretty clear on what the results are. And you don't have to, think that this time it's different because most likely history suggests that it's not different. It doesn't require a history major to sort that out. It's fairly cut and dried that there's a life cycle to societies and governments, economies, and countries, nations. Unfortunately, deterioration is not the funnest time to be around, irrespective of what you do, Judy, whether you're trying to control weather or bioengineer your food to control all these things. The fact of the matter is it cannot be controlled, and that the end result is pretty much a certain outcome. And then, of course, from there, people seem to clean up their act. And those hard times, I think, Judy, tend to self correct. And here you go again. And people want to try to make it better. And maybe I'm not correct in that thinking, but that's generally the alignment if you do a little bit of work on the history side of things. Why don't we move into just energy in general here and just talk a little bit about that? And I appreciate the time, and because I know you have better things to do than talk to me all day. But I think an area that really the wheels are starting to come off is this promote of wind and solar. Because to me, both of these forms of energy, Judy, and I'm itching to hear your opinion here, but this form of energy production has a giant footprint in terms of land usage and destruction of that land through the leaching of materials into the soils, but also heavy use of materials. Of course, the mining sector will flourish irrespective of what energy we use, but also frequent maintenance need and component replacement periods are quite short compared to alternative forms. And then also just significant issues on life cycle and recycling supply chain problems, which we haven't even solved. Huge waste impact, in my opinion. and also battery panel blade parts waste as well as part of this. And then, of course, all of this impacts wildlife and the environment in ways that we really haven't quantified yet. It's pretty ugly. And I guess I would just borrow a term from a colleague that we both know, Ian Plimer, and it's not renewable, it's ruinable. And that wind and solar struggle to work just on wind alone and solar alone, Judy, because they really only function with subsidies. Some of these projects might be economically viable, but generally it's pretty upside down. It's certainly a step backwards, in my opinion, after spending since 2016, we've been in the investment side of the energy sector, looking at energy investments, and predominantly we had settled with a big focus on sources of energy inclusive of commercial nuclear power. And fission is the best thing that we have going for us. There's a large fleet of commercial reactors around the world, and that fleet is growing, although be it small percentage growth, it is growing. And we are actually having a reversal of policies now that we're starting to see. And so for us, we had always looked at these forms of energy, and we've just determined that high quality, high density energy that comes in a fairly small footprint gets you back to commercial reactors. With that, we've had to take a hard look at why wind and solar is out here. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that just after my long windedness. But what do you think of wind and solar, and what do you think is a reasonable general solution for energy?
Well, I think offshore wind is an unmitigated disaster. The costs are huge. The replacement cycle is very short. The ecological damage is tremendous. So I think people are starting to come to realize this, that offshore wind is just not going to work. I think onshore wind, in some locations, they are currently helping. When you have penetration of maybe 20, 25% of wind power, it makes your grid a lot more difficult to operate, but it's not doing a whole lot of harm. The ideas of trying to bring wind to a much higher percentage, then you run into a great deal of trouble, and wind becomes very expensive in terms of all you need asynchronous condensers, and on it goes, and it's intermittent, and everybody knows that the utility scale batteries aren't going to work. So we need to just get over the idea that wind is a good solution. It may have some niche applications, but it's not a good solution. I think there's more upside for solar in terms of technological advances, that continue in photovoltaics. I think there is a role for rooftop solar. I mean, it puts the energy where you need it. I mean, in your structure, and it doesn't, have a land footprint beyond the structure. I think wind farms are a bad idea. So I think there's, a role for rooftop solar. People like the idea of autonomy, having their power generated local and not subject to random, crazy, whatever might happen. I mean, I have rooftop solar at my house for energy security reasons. I have it with 2 Tesla power walls. So if the electric grid goes out, I mean, I have electricity. So people like that for personal energy security. I mean, the alternative is a propane tank, but that is a solution for now. It may not be real viable long term. So no, I'm not a fan of wind and solar as some sort of major solution. I mean,
Yeah.
the transmission grid required is insane, and it's going to be extremely expensive. People say, "Oh, it's free. Wind in the sun is free." Well, it really is not. It's extremely expensive, much more expensive than your coal and gas generated electricity. I agree that I like the generation for nuclear power plants. There's, really exciting advances, the modular reactors and thorium and salt cooling and air cooling and on it goes, and able to recycle your fuel. And there's just so many advances that are being made, So when I look ahead to 2100, I mean, we'll be mostly nuclear. It's hard to imagine that we won't be. I like geothermal, some of the new geothermal technologies. I think this is a good solution in some regions, including the American West. So I think we'll see more of geothermal. But the point is we have to drop these deadlines. We have to explore these technologies, develop the learning curve, and assess the full life cycle costs of all these things and assess their impact on overall energy cost and reliability and security. And, we need to assess all these things, and we have to, just let the learning curve play out. I mean, it makes total sense to reimagine a 21st century electricity infrastructure, to move away from gas and coal. But, going back to wind and solar is certainly not the way to go. So, I mean, we just have to allow it to play out. But the most important thing is just to drop these crazy targets and deadlines, which is pushing us in the direction of wind and solar.
Really good, sensible points. There are certainly applications for wind and solar, and maybe I came across a little bit too harsh, but certainly there are special niche applications for both. On a widespread commercial basis, I don't think they're sensible compared to high density, high quality energy that you can get out of a commercial reactor. Of course, I mean, when you could take a can of Coke and power your life with a can of Coke of enriched uranium, you cannot look past that. And if you can get to the point where you can prove commercial and economic viability of fusion power, that is amazing. That's the holy grail, in my opinion. If we're going to look at other planets, Judy, of course, wind and solar panels aren't going to get our spaceships to those planets. We have to look at fusion. We have to look at propulsion that's sensible. Absolutely agreed with that. And, it's interesting. Some parts of the world, hydro flourishes. Other parts of the world aren't amenable to hydro. And then some parts of the world, Judy, as you know, hydro is being pulled out. And hydro certainly is very proven form. You look at the footprints of these various pieces, there's lots of questions on wind and solar with respect to total footprint and total impact. Some of the other long-term forms, we've obviously been able to measure pretty well some of those impacts. And then the life of some of these things. So, when you look at a commercial reactor today, depending on what country, whether it's Japan or Russia or China, depending on where these are being built, India, most of these reactors now are being looked at for 60-year initial license, 40-year initial license. There's been talk of 100-year licenses. That is impressive. So good discussion there, and certainly do what's sensible. And of course, enough about radiation and some of the waste and the various impacts that people have utilized and weaponized in terms of when you go back to nuclear being something that has been spun around fear for many, many decades. And of course, coming out of the oil lobby, of course, back in the day, and some of the accidents that had occurred. When you look at that and you look at the actual measurable impact, it's not what was overblown and was not certainly something that was promoted by Hollywood or what have you. The narrative has evolved, I suppose, over the last many decades. We have a reactor history that is very, very amenable to expansion. When you look at it on a per terawatt hour basis of generation, you have a huge safety record that's very impressive compared to all other forms. And I think we're still trying to quantify the impacts of fossil fuels on general pollution and how that's impacted cities. But I like how you think it should be in terms of how we should probably look at energy going forward. And there's some very good viable solutions, and the technology is improving substantially. So just a couple other things here. Carbon credits and carbon taxes. What are your thoughts on this? This has obviously been something that's been going on for decades. Talk about that. And then also, I'm sure you've heard of the term ESG, environmental social governance. What are your thoughts on those two trendy items?
Okay, carbon credits and ESG are pointless exercises. They're not going to accomplish anything, and probably end up doing more harm than good. So I have no time for carbon credits or ESG. With regards to carbon taxes, this is a credible mechanism. We tax far stupider things than carbon. So should we really be taxing our income rather than consumption? So, at a high level, a carbon tax makes sense in context of our taxes that are already too high. Nobody wants another tax. So in principle, I think a carbon tax makes sense, but in practice, it's not very popular because of all the other taxes that are out there. So, there's no substitute for innovation, for research and development into new energy technologies, better agricultural practices, new methods for making cement and steel and all the other things that artificial intelligence and so forth. I mean, there's no, we can't sort of just reshuffle the deck with taxes and credits and whatever. We just need to enlarge the size of the the deck through our innovation. I mean, that's the way forward.
Well said on that. And I think we'll leave it there. There's probably a few other things that we can talk about here, but I think just overall here, why don't we just discuss briefly the work you're presently doing, how folks can learn more about what you're doing, and then also where they can get your book, as well as any other final comments you'd like to leave our audience with on how to think about climate and how they should maybe go and do some of their own research, for example, and where they might start.
Well, a good starting point is my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, and you can buy it at Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, and a lot of online sellers. It shouldn't be hard to find. It's currently in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. An audio version is in the works. I also have a blog called Climate Etc. The address is judithcurry.com. We discuss a lot of interesting topics ranging from climate science to energy systems to policy and politics. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @CurryJA. My company is Climate Forecast Applications Network. The website is cfanclimate.net. And my company is about helping businesses and government agencies manage their weather and climate related risks through probabilistic forecasts and risk management approaches.
Some people do listen in that have, businesses. We have some mining companies that listen into our podcast, et cetera. Just one more plug for your business and your consulting business. How can you help some of these companies?
I do have clients in the petroleum sector and mineral mining. Part of what I do for them relates to predicting extreme weather events. Flooding seems to be a big issue for mining, and having, short-term forecasts of flood potential or even seasonal forecasts or even like 5-year to 10-year outlooks as to whether this mine is going to have too much water in the vicinity, not enough water to support mining operations. I mean, that's one example. So,
Perfect.
helping people with, any weather or climate related risks to their mining operations.
That is absolutely perfect because that fits in really well with what we're talking about and a lot of people we talk to. So that's great. I think that gives people a flavor for some of the services you can offer and then also some of the other areas in which you're offering consulting aside from your book. Judy, look, really appreciate the time. This has been a great conversation. I hope you'll come back. Thank you again for taking the time talking to our audience.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed it.